everyone, and welcome back. My name is Ryan Bonfiglio, and I'm working with St. Luke's on this series designed to help you explore the complex topic of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from a biblical perspective. In our last session, we took a look at the nature of God's promise of land to the Israelites. While the land is no doubt theologically significant all throughout the Old Testament, we saw that the promise of the land was not only a means to the end of blessing others, but it also was a contingent promise, contingent on Israel's faithfulness to the covenant. What's more, we saw that at no point in Israelite history was access to the land necessary for full participation in God's covenant. Here in this third session, I want to take a more ethical approach to what the Bible has to say about the land of Israel. In particular, I want to return to an observation we made in session 1. That is, that at no point in history has the land of Israel ever been exclusively occupied by the people of Israel. It's always been a mixed land, a land mixed with many different types of people. This means two things. First, many ancient Jews would have lived outside of the land of Israel in places like Babylonia or Egypt or Turkey or even Spain. The Bible refers to non-Israelites living in the land outside of Israel as goy, or as foreigners. The other thing that this means is that those Israelites living within the land of Israel most certainly would have had many non-Israelite neighbors. The biblical term for these people is not goy, that's the foreigner who lives outside of the land. Rather, the foreigner who lives inside of the land of Israel is called a ger. Often translated as stranger or alien, the Hebrew term ger refers to one who is forced to leave his nation of origin, often due to famine or pestilence or military invasion, to live somewhere else. Modern terms such as immigrant or refugee, I think, would closely approximate what the Old Testament means when it refers to a ger. In the ancient world, the ger would have faced precarious circumstances. Disconnected from their families and kinship networks, and often unable to possess land, the ger almost inevitably faced poverty and marginalization. They were an economically and socially vulnerable group of people. The Old Testament's commentary on the ger is complex, and admittedly, it's sometimes conflicted. But on the whole, the various legal materials found in the Old Testament offer a relatively consistent set of commandments and statutes that highlight Israel's responsibility to protect the foreigner living among them and living within the land, and further, not just to protect them, but to provide for their well-being. Here in this session, I want to explore the broader contours of how the ger are treated within Old Testament law. Now, the starting point for the law's approach to the stranger could be found in Exodus 22:21, which states this, quote, "You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt." In other words, when it comes to how you should treat your non-Israelite neighbor, the starting point is to do no harm. Now, what is also striking about this verse is the presence of the motivation clause. Why should you do no harm to the foreigner living among you? Quote, "For you were aliens," or ger, in the land of Egypt. Being slaves in the land of being slaves in the land of Egypt for some 400 years, the Israelites knew all too well what it was like to be a ger living in the foreign country. In Egypt, the Israelites faced relentless work and brutal conditions. Having been freed from the yoke of Pharaoh, Israel is not to impose Pharaoh-like conditions on the ger in their country. This point is driven home by the fact that the word for oppress, which is used here in this verse, appears also in Exodus 3:9, where it describes how Pharaoh treated the Israelites. Do you see what's happening here? The engine of this ethic is empathy. This text is saying, don't inflict on others what has caused you yourself so much pain. The logic of the motivation clause extends beyond the particular generation of Israelites who had been enslaved in Egypt. One might say in many ways that all future Israelites, and maybe indeed all of us, will in some way experience estrangement in our lives, whether that estrangement happens in our families, with loved ones or friends, in jobs, in communities, even in places of worship. The recognition of our own experiences of estrangement should fuel and sustain our commitment to do no harm when it comes to our interaction with strangers, whether immigrants or refugees or others who are thought to be considered outsiders in the communities in which we live. Exodus 22:21 invites us to end the cycle of hurting people. So that's reason number one, empathy. The Old Testament law builds on this idea and provides another reason why, when it comes to foreigners living among them, ancient Israel should do no harm. We see this in Deuteronomy 10:17-19. The passage goes like this. For the Lord your God is God of God and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and who loves the strangers or the ger, providing them food and clothing. You also should love the stranger, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. The last part repeats what we already have learned. Love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Israel. Again, there's that point of empathy. But earlier, we hear about God's disposition to the stranger. Of all of the things that could be affirmed theologically about who God is and what God does in the world, this verse affirms that this is a God, Israel's God, is one who loves the stranger and actively provides for them. It's as if loving the stranger is part of God's basic nature. It's in God's divine DNA. And this matters for us too, doesn't it? For it tells us what type of God we have been made in the image of. We, friends, are made in the image of a stranger loving God. So when we then love the stranger, we most fully reflect God's image in our life. So these two passages alone offer a powerful ethical vision of ancient Israel's responsibility toward the stranger. But this is only the starting point. Many other verses get even more specific about how Israel is to live with the ger in their midst. For instance, consider Leviticus 23:22, in which we find the law of gleaning. If you've had a course with me at St. Luke's before, I bet I've already taught on this verse, so bear with me if this is a little bit of repetition. The law in Leviticus 23:22 requires that a certain portion of one's farmland, and remember, all ancient people for the most part were farmers, it requires that a certain portion of one's farmland should be left unharvested. This portion should be left unharvested and made available to the poor and the stranger within the community. What is imagined here is something of a social welfare system, insofar as the law of gleaning attempts to meet the basic needs of members of the community who would have been most socially and economically vulnerable. However, the practice imagined really is quite a bit different than how we often approach these matters with things like food pantries or soup kitchens. Rather than asking the landowner to give away some of the product at the time of the harvest, the law pictures the stranger coming onto the land itself and doing the work of harvesting side by side with the landowner. Not only is the stranger engaged in the work rather than being a recipient of a handout, but the stranger has the chance to know and interact with the Israelite who owns the land. So what is imagined here, think of it, is not simply a form of charity, but rather it's a way of fostering community and connection between all of the members of the community, including the Israelite landholders and the ger who'd have lived in the land and not had access to land. In this particular practice, agency and dignity of the ger are prioritized. It's pretty cool. Now, another way of actively providing for the ger is described in Deuteronomy 14:28 and 29. This law stipulates that once every 3 years, the tithe that one would typically give to the temple, remember a tithe is 10%, and in the case of the ancient world, that had been 10% of all of the produce brought forth from your land. Every year, you typically think of the tithe as going to the temple. But in this third year, in 1 out of 3 years, Deuteronomy 14 says that the tithe should be kept in the local community so that, quote, the resident aliens, here again, that's Ger, the orphans and the widows in your towns may come and eat their fill. In this context, the tithe owed to the temple would have come in the form of crops or livestock from one's field. Thus, the tithe would have been immediately useful for sustaining the needs of food insecure individuals. Here, by keeping the tithe within the land and making it available to local strangers and orphans and widows, a religious obligation is regularly set aside to support the needs of the community, including the Ger. Or perhaps more to the point, Deuteronomy 14 defines caring for the physical needs of those in your local community, including the Ger, as a religious obligation on par with giving to the temple. It's really a remarkable system of ethical arrangements that this text is setting up. But there's another feature in Deuteronomy 14 that I want to highlight. It's the fact that the Ger are grouped together along with the presumably Israelite orphan and widow. This triad of orphan, widow, stranger is found repeatedly in the Old Testament, but it is generally absent in other ancient Near Eastern law codes. Non-biblical legal materials, such as the Code of Hammurabi from the 18th century BCE, which you might have heard of in some form, places a greater emphasis on protecting the orphan and the widow, but they never include the Ger in such protections. You see, what's happening here is that the unique innovation of the Old Testament is not so much that it says that those vulnerable should be treated with justice. Other law codes had provisions for treating the vulnerable of the people with justice and compassion. There's nothing new about that really in the Old Testament. The real innovation is that the Old Testament extends to the foreigner, to the Ger, the same ethic of justice that's extended to other Israelites. It believes, in other words, the Old Testament does, that kinship ties are not prerequisites when it comes to protecting the most vulnerable members of society. Under Israelite law, marginalized and needy individuals are to be cared for regardless of their nation of origins, or we might say their citizenship. It's really a remarkable ethic, and it really sets the Old Testament apart from many other ancient Near Eastern law codes. A similar dynamic plays out in Deuteronomy 1, verse 16, which states, quote, I charged your judges at that time, give the members of your community a fair hearing, and judge rightly between one person and another, whether citizen or Ger, or resident alien. Even more explicitly than the text discussed already, Deuteronomy 1:16 underscores that in the context of the court proceedings, the Ger and the Israelite should have equal status and footing. There are not to be two different sets of laws, or even one law applied differently between Israelites and non-Israelites. Whether or not this was actually followed all the time remains to be seen. But nevertheless, the very presence of this statute in the canon suggests that there was this emphasis on dissolving lines of difference between the Ger and the Israelite living together. Now, there's one final text I want to highlight, and it might be the one that you're most familiar with. In Leviticus 19, we find the famous words, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. A commandment which, of course, Jesus later refers to as being the second most important commandment in all of the law. The interpretive issue with this verse is whether or not the obligation to love one's neighbor only applies to one's Israelite neighbor. So, in other words, if I'm living next to a foreigner, whether it's a Canaanite or a Hittite, does the obligation to love my neighbor still apply? Or does it only apply when my neighbor is an Israelite? Well, Leviticus 19, if we keep reading, seems to anticipate this potential problem. For just a few verses later, we read this. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself. This text is not merely transferring the obligation to love one's Israelite neighbor to one's non Israelite neighbor, though it definitely does that. Rather, this text goes a step further in that it calls for something more radical. It calls for us to redefine what a stranger is in the first place. It's inviting us to see the stranger not as another, not as a foreigner, but as a fellow citizen and indeed a neighbor. As such, Leviticus 19 reaches beyond the notion of generosity or even hospitality. And it calls us to question the assumptions, the narratives, the perspectives that lead to the very creation of the label stranger in the first place. Now, when relating ancient Israel's legal tradition to contemporary matters, not least of which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it is rarely ever the case that we can say, the Bible says it, that settles it. This is as true for the situation with the ger as it is for laws about not wearing garments made of two kinds of fibers, which one can find in Leviticus 19:19, or the use of capital punishment for those who work on the Sabbath, which is described in Exodus 35:2. The enormous historical and cultural gap that exists between ancient Israel and contemporary society, and even contemporary Israel, calls for a more sophisticated hermeneutic or way of engaging with these ancient laws. Such an approach, I think, should attempt to illuminate how the theological and ethical principles beneath the ancient practice described by a given law can best be embodied and expressed in modern practice. The Old Testament law on the ger doesn't then give us an immigration policy or a peace treaty or anything like that. And it doesn't narrowly affirm a certain political party's platform or perspective on the modern day conflict. It truly doesn't. But what we've seen about what the law has to say about the ger gives those of us who look to the Old Testament as a sacred text a conceptual framework for discussing how we might approach immigrants and refugees in ways that are just, compassionate, and generous. When it comes to this modern Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think, friends, the goal is not to distance ourselves from these ancient Old Testament texts that situate Israel and its land and God in close proximity. Rather, I think our challenge actually is to move toward the Old Testament texts, to listen carefully again to what they have to say about Israel's obligation to the foreigner living among them. This is a word not only for Israel today to pay attention to, but maybe even more to the point for us to pay attention to, that we come to see both Jewish and Muslim neighbor not as stranger, but as friend and as someone who fully reflects the image of God.